The Jetsons, Charlton issue 16. Astro makes it clear he's got a crush on a dog named Fifi on a commercial. I wonder why Elroy has to tell George this if it's already happened a few times. And then I remember Elroy goes to school for such a short amount of time a day that he's back at home by lunch, so he'd be home longer than George is. Enough to see Astro's reaction to the TV a bunch. The second panel was a waste of time if you don't find it funny to look at. Somehow George thinks it's just a coincidence instead of believing Elroy, and he says he has to get someone's signature on a contract for gears. And it's such a huge coincidence that he'll see Fifi because of it. Since Astro can understand English, he insists on coming along. And George drives all the way over there and lands the car on another planet. Not that you can tell. The jerk owner of Fifi insists on insulting Astro. Why did he say his dog would never associate with a common dog when it's obvious he's wrong? And that a dog would never know the difference? I'd say he was handed the conflict ball, but for all I know he's always like a jerk. The dogs run away and he tells George to go after them. He shouldn't have to tell him more than once. And he has no reason to think anything would happen to Fifi because of a dog that clearly likes her. George grabs Astro's tail and falls in the mud for comedy relief. He drives away with him, and the story ends with some confusing dialogue from George. He says that the guy with the silly name mailed him the signed contracts, and Fifi sent Astro a big bone because Fifi wouldn't do the commercials unless he let her and Astro be friends. Which he figured out. Even though he was somehow stupid enough to think she was crying because Astro was troubling her. In the next story, George comes home mad at Rosie for being in his chair, and Jane wants to help him because he's tired. A toy plane hits George, and Rosie has the gall to tell him to be quiet because she's trying to read the newspaper. Jane defends her anyways because she's been working hard all day, although that clearly doesn't justify the maid acting like that. And she says the family needs a vacation because the whole family's been working hard. George compliments her idea, and I don't blame him for wanting a vacation without Rosie with her bad behavior. But it should be obvious the family would have a harder time living without her, unless the place she's planning to vacation at will have people clean up and cook for them. She's got no reason to accuse him of saying he doesn't mean that. He insists to Rosie that he wants his chair, and Jane finally defends him even if she doesn't respect him. It wouldn't be so bad if we were shown another chair in front of the TV. There should be other chairs because I saw them in previous stories. But this comic doesn't have continuity, so it looks like he'd be expected to sit on the floor. She falls into him, and somehow nobody asks him if he's okay, all worried about him, because something heavy and made of metal crashed into him. I like that instead of Rosie complaining about him not wanting her on a vacation, which the maid normally wouldn't get entitled to anyways, she just says she'll get dinner. The family acts sad for a few panels. George tells him off in a way that makes me wonder why he still thinks of her as just a piece of machinery, and Astro bites him. Because it's just a cartoon where he can get away with that, despite having human intelligence. I doubt Jane would refer to Rosie's eyes as visual sensors just because she's a robot, when that's not how the phrase goes. The next morning, George says he closed down Rosie's circuits and removed her power cells so she won't know they even left. Then how is she crying? I get why the writer's trying to make us feel sorry for Rosie, but I don't know what he was thinking having her act antagonistically to George at the start, if we were supposed to think she deserves to go with them. Finally, the story makes it clear why George made a mistake because Jane tells him to unfold lawn chairs. Thankfully, it's explained why Jane never does it, because George can't and ends up trapped. I have to admit, it is charming to see Astro smiling at this while he's told it isn't that funny. George is told to start the fire for their barbecue because Rosie always did it before, and he gets overwhelmed by the smoke. There's no reason he'd ask Jane what she did to the steaks when he started the fire. She punishes them by telling him to do the dishes. But she would have made him do that anyways. The next morning, the family's happy to hear Rosie because George woke her up and got her here because she needs a vacation too. But how's it a vacation if she's just going to be doing all the same work for them that she always does? I guess she really likes to be with the family because she isn't pointing this out. In the next story, it's called Some Toys Revenge, so at least for once it's honest about the fact that he's going to do something sociopathic on purpose. Because usually he does something to inconvenience George and that isn't confirmed. George is mad about the TV breaking down when he wanted to watch a football game. I really hate that he's written to tell Elroy to stop pretending Sum's playing with them, and then wish he would stop that nonsense about him. I wonder if it's the same writer who did this in issue 2. As it's blatantly obvious that he knows Sum exists. He would have heard him walk around and sit down behind him before the first panel. Elroy says Sum doesn't want George to see him. Sum uses his magic powers to jump into the TV without breaking it, and brags about the fact that he fixed it. If all Elroy has to do to wake George is tell him to wake up, there's no excuse for him saying that the TV started working by itself when Sum just said he fixed it in front of him. The story ends with the football getting thrown out of the TV and at his head. That's his only revenge. I know it hurt, but that's lame for a story with that title. Why did he want to get back at him for not believing he exists and being mean to Elroy about him when he doesn't want him to see him for no reason? The story comes off like he didn't have this happen on purpose. He really had no reason to think that three-dimensional TV would be better. So he must have. After the previous story, it's almost cathartic that golf clubs fall out of the closet on him. George doesn't like Rosie vacuuming up his trout flies, which she dismisses as weird junk, and he doesn't explain why they're valuable. He somehow takes the risk of hitting a robot, damaging his golf club in the process. Naturally, Jane tells him off for it, but for the wrong reason, that Rosie's a lady. Since she's a robot completely unharmed by that, it's not really crossing the line that he did this, because he wants to treat a normal maid like that. Once again, we have the story where he tries to get rid of Rosie when he should know his family is going to be sad about it and tantrum him into getting her back. This time, he shouldn't have left his junk lying around on the floor when he should have known she'd end up vacuuming it. And he also could have avoided this by telling her what the trout flies were ahead of time. And he wouldn't have had stuff from a closet fall on him if she warned him ahead of time not to open it. But if she thought it was a good idea to overstuff the closet that much and close the door, she didn't think ahead in the first place. So she really did do something incompetent in the story by not thinking to stuff half of this stuff in a different closet, or at least put it right next to it. What if George got really hurt? Maybe he might have in real life. So that should have been written to make it look like he wasn't a total strawman here. And when your arguments can't even stand up to strawman, there's a problem. Because he's once again being provoked into this. He tells the robot control department's representative that he wants a male robot replacement. Some people go to his house, and Rosie has no reason to turn her back to him, make it easy for her to be turned off. So I have to assume she's just hard programmed to act like this to make it easy for anyone who wants to repair or retrieve her, regardless of how opposed she is to it. Why is it the stupid butler robot from the 60s comic again? Was he in the show? He looks like the same one, and it's annoying because it makes it even more predictable that he's gonna suck. Surprisingly, he isn't about forcing upper-class snobby things on the family this time. Instead, he says he's not programmed for dishwashing and window cleaning just because those are female chores, even though it's the future. What George obviously should have done instead was order a male maid bot, but apparently those don't exist, because that kind of general is still popular in the future. He should have known he'd have to order a new maid bot. It comes out of nowhere that he'd insist on getting a male robot, as if Rosie's gender was the problem when it wasn't. Unless she thought that her being female was why she can get away with anything. But I always had the impression that she thought that because the family's dependent on her and freaks out when her job is at stake. It's not like he always wants to try to hurt the maid. And he should know that he wouldn't get away with it anyways. So because he somehow thought hiring a butler instead of a maid wouldn't permanently put him in the doghouse with his family, he gets served a vitamin cocktail by him, while Jane and Judy are being useful for once. Jane's washing the window that's colored like a wall anyways, and Judy's vacuuming. I'm supposed to hate this, but I actually like that they're being productive. And Judy says the steak from Horace was too rare. And even though it's the future, Judy says a sexist remark as if all men overcook meat, which is confusing because chefs are usually men, and he's a chef. Somehow. because apparently that wasn't designated as a female chore, despite how Judy talks here. He invites a robot friend to his house, and George gets annoyed at him playing poker at the table. George complains about them smoking his best cigars and drinking the imported brandy. Suddenly it's like Futurama where the robots smoke despite nicotine doing nothing for them, just because they want to look cool. Which is what Bender said, but they don't explain it, making it look arbitrary. You'd think a butler robot would be programmed to never do this without permission. And it's not explained that the robots drink alcohol for fuel like in Futurama, but that has to be the case. Or they want to drink it at all because it damaged them. And this has the fact that George drinks brandy come out of nowhere. He was shown to smoke one time in the 60s comic though. Are they not allowed to show it if it's not mandatory for the plot? Then why are they allowed to reference it? He says his butler won't listen to him either. Wasn't they programmed to never be like this? There's no reason robot servants would have that amount of free will. It defeats the purpose of going through all the trouble of producing them. Jane says Rosie would know what to do if she were here, and he wishes she was. So she rushes into the room and Horace leads with her chasing him. Jane says that off screen she told the delivery men to leave Rosie here until they were sure they wanted Horace. So all she had to do was reactivate her off screen. It's disappointing that we don't see Rosie do anything against Horace, like throw something at him. But it could have been worse. In the next story, it's ridiculously forced right away that Judy's new boyfriend would have his hair completely covering his face, and we never see it. She wants to date him because he doesn't look good at all. They're dancing to a record, and George thinks it's too loud, and Judy tells Hubert to turn it off. Hubert's unsympathetically saying he's out of date, even though you wouldn't have to think that to hate music being too loud. He's got every reason to tell him to go home because it's after 11, so they should be sleeping. Somehow, Hubert asks if he's trying to tell him something. George tells him to comb his hair, as if that would fix his problem. He treats George like he's ignorant, somehow expecting me to believe that anyone other than him is going for the Cousin It hairstyle. So it's satisfying when George kicks him out of the house. Too bad there's a flash of light censoring it, when the artist would know we don't want that. Jane's a horrible wife by picking a fight with George for this when it was past 11. So no parent would be okay with that. He says she doesn't even know what he really looks like. I wish he said that he can't drive a car with that hair, making him have to rely on others to drive for him. So that'd be a great argument for why he shouldn't marry Judy later. Judy acts completely melodramatic, saying that her life is ruined and she'll never look at another man and she'll be a hermit, when he clearly had every reason to kick him out for overstaying his welcome and being rude to him. Judy's nice to Hubert over the video phone and tells him to get his hair cut. She says she loves him twice, thankful that he actually agreed. It turns out he's not good looking enough for her because he's got a long pointy nose. And that's it. Otherwise, he's one of the best looking guys she's dated so far. How does he think he's glorious looking? He would have been teased for his nose his whole life. And that could have been why he grew out his hair in the first place. So she looks shallow and unsympathetic for kicking him out. You'd think she would have made sure to find out what his face looked like a lot earlier and avoided the plot. Who wouldn't? In the next story, George gets overwhelmed by Jane and Rosie telling him that they need a new vacuum and automatic meal-o-matic, and says they should stop wasting money. He says they won't buy any more new appliances, and he's gonna fix anything that breaks from now on. Oh boy, another story where the writer doesn't know he's good at fixing things. Of course he screws up. And I wish just cut to that point right away to save on time. If he says he's always been handy with tools, and wanted to be an inventor as a boy, there's no excuse for him sucking at this. I'd expect him to be fixing all of his appliances anyways if he can fix a futuristic car in a Food-O-Matic. The story ends with George calling appliance repair while under the bed. That sucked. George frustratingly interrupts Elroy while bragging that his old car can still drive fast, and then a traffic cop catches up to them. There's a complete miracle because he decides not to give him a ticket purely because he's in a good mood, when he doesn't look like he is. It's satisfying that after all of the tension that the traffic cop caused, and all of the different times they're a pain in the neck in the series that he says, give some people a little authority and it goes to their heads. But it only went to his head in the sense that he abused his authority by not ticketing someone just because he felt like it. It's too obvious he's gonna get in trouble anyways because there's a page left in this. George rants while driving away and somehow he starts speeding again, as he rants that he should have reported him. Which doesn't make sense for him to say because he benefited from him not acting properly. Elroy points and somehow George tells him it's rude to point rather than looking in his direction like anyone would. And says he's rude like that idiot who tried to tell him how to drive. It's confusing that the traffic cop says this is just a warning when he's writing him a ticket anyways. And somehow the ticket's for talking too much. The Jetsons, Charlton, issue 17. George notices all of the noise Rosie's making. She falls on her back, and somehow he thinks she's trying to get out of work despite all of the noise, and the fact that she breaks down constantly. At least the writer sort of justifies it, because he thinks she wants a robot doctor she's in love with to visit her, even if that doesn't explain it. I guess he only thinks the robot doctor's a quack because he's a robot. And you think he wouldn't think poorly of robots when nobody else does. Jane tells him to stop picking on her, and says Rosie has good taste in men, tells him to be nice to the doctor, who puts a stethoscope on her chest and says she has pain. Maybe George is just in denial because he doesn't want to believe she's got a problem that he'll have to pay for again. He sets the dials of his scanner to try to see where it is, and for some reason, he says it doesn't come out right. He hits her chest with a hammer, so George was actually right that he's a quack. That's shocking, but it's a pleasant surprise that he wasn't a totally wrong straw man. Rosie says like the doctor thought that her pain's in her head, and somehow he thinks acupuncture will work on a robot, despite her metal skin. He tells George to hold what Rosie doesn't recognize as a needle tight while he swings a hammer. Why is there a panel of just sound effects censoring the slapstick when we already saw the slapstick? Even if it was censored by light anyways. The doctor says Rosie's as good as new, hands George the check while thanking him for calling him, says she's fine, and when Rosie complains to George that she's in pain again, he cries. So he hits his robot patients with a hammer to get more visits and money out of them. This was supposed to be the ideal future of Earth. There's no point making it stereotypical instead. In the next story, George sees Rosie try to hypnotize herself into getting sleepy just by talking to herself in the mirror because she's very naive. Being a robot is probably only a few years old. George says a sleeping pill would work faster, which makes no sense because she's a robot. Then he somehow thinks hitting a robot with a bat would help her go to sleep, and thinks she'd be okay with it. She tells him she's taking a hypnosis course and needs a subject. He laughs at her idea, which you'd think he'd have done in the second panel, and Jane somehow sides with Rosie because she thinks her failing to hypnotize them or successfully doing it and humiliating them would be fun. Even if she succeeds, why try to teach your maid to have that kind of power over you? Why does she oppose George at every opportunity when it doesn't make her look compatible with him? It should have been Judy who had this position all the time. Then she'd have a personality besides just being boy crazy. Rosie tells them they're getting sleepy and are going way back in time, and somehow they fall into the sand and are frightened by being sent somewhere new. Somehow, instead of assuming they're dreaming right away because of Rosie's impossible success, they take this too seriously. And of course, they meet Fred Flintstone for the first time. This is the most ill-thought-out excuse for them to meet ever. But at least it's creative, so it might have taken a lot of thought in that sense. I just remember Fred as a jerk, so it's confusing that he's so nice to them on sight. He assumes they're going to a costume party. Then he acts two-faced by telling his wife they're weirdos behind their backs because he doesn't believe them about them being from the future. But at least he plans to be nice to them and give them a tour of Bedrock anyways. George wishes the seats of Fred's car were comfortable to sit on. And unfortunately, they end up running from dinosaurs without George asking how that's even possible. Which doesn't take advantage of him being from the future where people know better. I have to assume the dinosaurs are really genetically engineered and brought back wrong by scientists to make for a zoo, because not only would they not survive on our oxygen levels, but they're supposed to have feathers and don't. George gets picked up and carried by a giant bird and dropped on some unexplained fire. The fact that it's not explained makes it needlessly cruel. You'd think that all of the most dangerous animals such as these would have been constant victims of hunters wanting to make sure this wouldn't happen anymore. A pet tiger pulls Barney along by a leash in its mouth, as I wonder when Barney got a pet tiger. Something incredibly stupid of them to trust. Ellie's friend invites George to go bowling. Rosie calls Tom about what she did. I'm thankful to see her interact with them for the first time. He turns some dials as if he had already made a machine, just in case this would happen to them. And George and Jane warp back. They both wonder why they're thinking about the caveman days, and don't know where the stone bowling ball came from because amnesia is a part of the warping process. George throws the thing, and shockingly, someone asks his wife Wilma where his bowling ball is below George, and gets hurt by it. So this writer actually had the guts to make the fan theory about them being from the same time period canon. Why else would he say this? Fred did say they were saying they were from the 2070s as if they aren't really from that. But different countries can have different calendars. And since when is there a cloud there? You'd think if Rosie hypnotized them to go back in time, they would have only thought they went back in time, not brought a bowling ball with them. That being sense to where they were made it look like they were actually sent back in time. But this proves they weren't. So then, Rosie had reality warping powers because she read a hypnosis book somehow. Because I guess it was a book created by a witch whose powers rubbed off on it. And you'd think her reality powers would have literally sent them back in time. But instead her magical book disobeyed her and lazied out by simply sending the two to the surface of the planet because it looks like a more primitive time. And I don't get why it even thought to scan the planet in the present day for a place like the past. How would magic ever work properly if it can disobey its user to try to save on magic use? I really don't see the point of writing the Flintstones without explaining once why there's dinosaurs and humans coexisting. Because that's like not explaining why the main characters of a show don't need air to live when they live in space. At least it sorta subtly explained it because the final panel outright confirms that Fred lives in the same time period as George, meaning that the dinosaurs could have been made by scientists. But I'd rather it be confirmed than implied, and it doesn't explain why the surface people have cars like this just because they're less wealthy. In the next story, Elroy tells Astro it's nice of him to walk him home and calls him a real pal. So this is the first time he ever did this. What prompted that? Guess he just got him. Elroy wants to take the long way home because he's expected to take a note from the teacher to his mother. Why would he call her mother? Jane tells him off and expects an excuse for him not doing his homework. Elroy said he did his homework, but she makes him leave the house so early and he doesn't want to be the first one at school, so he plays on the way. He made a space plane out of it, and someone hijacked it. He means someone stole it after it landed. Someone hijacking it would be impossible. In the next story, Jane compliments Judy's outfit. George kisses Judy's cheek and compliments her dress and hopes she'll have a nice time with her boyfriend. As I'm glad the comic lets her have a new outfit. At least I hope it's new, because it'd be lame if it looked like the dress she always wears. She thanks him, and after patting, they're shocked to see how tall her boyfriend Melvin is. George wants him to tell him about some of his basketball games. And even though he says it was great to meet him, he's got neck pain from looking up at him so much. If this isn't realistic, it's insulting to tall people. In the next story, Jane tells George judgmentally that he does nothing but watch TV on his days off. And eventually I realize how hypocritical she is because she does nothing most of the time. So why doesn't he call her out on it? It's also not very fair of her because she can't think of anything for him to do. So she should be assuming he's got a right to relax when they've got a maid. George says he only works 2 days a week in this computerized age, so there's nothing for him to do. That applied to the house too with all of its machines. She tells him he should find something to do without an argument for why, making it look mean to her own husband when this applies to her, and she warns him that eating too much is getting him to gain weight, which is true. I'm proud of him when he actually asks Rosie if she'd mind him helping her with her work. Now I hope he won't be clumsy and break things while doing it again. Naturally, she says she doesn't want him messing things up. I only say naturally because of one of the earlier stories proving her right. Because normally a maid would agree to it. She says she'd only have to do everything over again. He's once again overly harsh with her because he's got a bad temper with her and finds her a reducing machine, so he assumes it's for losing weight. And I have to assume some made this, if not Elroy, because it's got no explanation. It better have one. That should be the first thing done. He gets drunken, of course, narrowly avoids getting crushed, but it is interesting because I don't know what he was nearly crushed by. There is something I can really compliment, and that's more realistic than a lot of plots like this, like the one Archie Sonic, because his voice isn't strong enough for anyone to hear it. And he can't cause Rosie any pain by kicking her. And he says she's got no feeling, which doesn't make sense because she's complained about pain to a robot doctor. So it really is because he's small. Astro tries to kill him when obviously he'd recognize him because he'd have the same appearance and scent. George loses his temper with him, which is so cringeworthy to see because he's his pet dog and he didn't have to, but he probably thought he had to defend himself to get him to stop trying to kill him. Somehow, Rosie thinks he's a bug and vacuums him up. It'd be too dark if it was confirmed that they know it's George and are jumping on a lame excuse to kill him. So there is no excuse. George sneezes and she hears it again, so those two panels were wasted. She frees him, and Elroy returns him to normal and says summon him and vent to the machine. Him saying some toy now makes it clear how redundant it is for some to be good with gadgets. Elroy almost never gets his time to shine as inventor in the comics, so I'm still assuming that some did all of the work. George says he's got an idea for a machine because of Elroy. Elroy says he knows a lot about electronics, but that doesn't really help because he doesn't explain that he did have to work on this. So in the context of the comic, it comes out of nowhere. The story ends with George planning to make a spanking machine, another dating of the comic, when there already was one in a page in the 60s comic, so why doesn't it exist? The first story has Astro insists on going along with George like a human to the owner of his favorite dog from a commercial, who George miraculously has to sign a business contract with. And Astro runs away with his dog, who conveniently for him likes him on first sight, which annoys the business owner because he's a snob. So George has to run after Astro, and the final panel is George says stuff to explain how it got to a happy ending, because there wasn't enough space to show Phoebe refusing to do a commercial, and her owner finally saying he'll humor her, since it wasted too many of its panels. George having to drive a flying car in outer space to get to that guy's house is the only thing that made it sci-fi, and it wasn't necessary for the plot, because he might as well have had a house on Earth. The plot was too predictable and lazy right away, with it immediately boring me with its cliche premise. The second story is about Rosie provoking George into not wanting her on a vacation because she sat in his chair and didn't care that he got hurt. So once again there's a story where Rosie's the Karma Houdini, and George goes overboard to spite her, which doesn't mean she should have no punishment for being out of line in the first place. It's a mundane plot where George can't replace Rosie, go figure, and his family should have told him that ahead of time. But he wouldn't have listened and avoided the plots because he thought he would be able to unfold a lawn chair and use a barbecue. Where's the sci-fi in this story? The third story that somehow has George not believe in Some again has Some make his broken TV three-dimensional with no benefit to himself, getting him hit with a football. It sucked because of George's dialogue alone. The fourth story is another plot where George tries to get rid of Rosie when he should know he'd be in the doghouse with his family the whole time. And of course the replacement sucks to force the status quo back. So it's a good thing it's in a different way to justify the cliche story. But it doesn't make any sense that in the ideal future, Horace refuses to do certain chores not because he's a manservant, but because they're female chores, when he still cooks for them. And it's definitely not believable that he's got the free will to invite his friends over to play poker with him, and that he doesn't listen to his boss when he's a robot. It seems to take advantage of the sci-fi environments because there's robots and a robot delivery man with a crate, but it only really does that because Rosie was reactivated off-screen. It could have been about George firing a normal maid and getting a butler instead for the same plot. It's forced that he wanted a male robot because Rosie's gender was never the problem for him. She caused him to fire her for a different, very good reason. But once again, nobody acknowledged that he had a good reason. The fourth story is tedious because after George has every reason to get mad at Judy's ridiculous-looking boyfriend for playing loud music at 11 at night and calling him out of date, he kicks him out like anybody would, just to be demonized by Jane for it because she just likes being against him. It's force of habit at this point because sure, she would sympathize with her daughter and be a hopeless romantic, but he was overstaying his welcome. It was impossible to take Hubert seriously because he somehow had his hair in front of his entire face, and somehow expected us to believe it's a popular hairstyle. He at least agrees to cut his hair, only for Judy to hate how he looks because she somehow didn't know about it and kick him out. So why did he even agree to cut his hair in the first place, if he should have known this would happen? Where is the sci-fi in this story? This was aggravating. The final story has George get pulled over for speeding and make a decision nobody ever would by going right back to speeding after he was somehow not given a ticket. He somehow rants as if the traffic cop was being rude after that, and when he gets another ticket, somehow isn't for speeding. It's the nicest traffic cop ever, but he isn't drawn to look like it. And it's too rare that I see this kind of thing, so the whole story just had tension instead of me appreciating him, as I always thought he'd get it fine. The story didn't really take advantage of the sci-fi setting because it could have been about normal cars instead of flying cars. This issue was frustrating. The first story was about Rosie getting an inexplicable house visit from a doctor who somehow thinks it's okay to hit her with a hammer a lot. That sucked. It didn't do anything with her having a crush on him, like have her say she's over it now. The second story went from one potential plot where somehow Jane agrees to let Rosie hypnotize her and George, which could have led to a bunch of different things, to the most arbitrary excuse for a Flintstones crossover. Why didn't the story explain that the hypnosis book has witch magic on it, from some toy, since he knew to make a machine to bring them back home ahead of time? It's just about George suffering because of the most predictable reasons, with not enough happening. So while it could have been exciting and mattered from a crossover, it was just pointless. The third story eventually has Elroy explained to Jane that he made a paper plane out of his homework and someone stole it, resulting in a teacher sending him home with a note for not having his homework done. This had nothing to do with sci-fi at all and was just depressing, but at least it was creative, even if the first page is technically pointless. The fourth story was a lazy plot where George eventually meets a really tall guy and has neck pain because he had to look up at him so long. And it could have just been one page because the first one was completely expendable. The final story has George want to lose weight and use Elroy's reducing machine to shrink because Elroy never told him what it was and had it out in the open for no reason. So he has to deal with the giant Rosie and Astro even though they'd obviously recognize him instantly. Not vacuum him. Good thing she hears his sneeze. But I've already seen a shrunken character sneeze in a vacuum in Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog. So the only new thing this did to make it interesting was that George had to avoid Astro's attack and failed to cause Rosie pain because he's small, and establish that Elroy helped some make the device. But when he was small, not enough happened to take advantage of it. So this issue sucked.